Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. With us today is Dr. Buz Kloot. Dr. Kloot is a research associate professor in the Environmental Health Sciences Department at the University of South Carolina's Arnold School of Public Health. He is a farmer-first researcher, a philosophy that guides him in his dual roles as a researcher and storyteller of living soils and regenerative farming. He is passionate about doing research on working farmlands and collaborating directly with farmers on soil health research and projects. Dr. Kloot looks at how farmers can leverage regenerative farming systems while paying attention to the biology that improves per acre income, primarily through savings in fertilizer. Dr. Kloot began his career as a chemical engineer. He spent 12 years in the mining and mineral processing industry in Namibia, Africa, prior to joining the University of South Carolina. He holds degrees in chemical engineering from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a Master of Business Administration and PhD in Environmental Health Sciences from the University of South Carolina. During this webinar episode, Dr. Kloot will challenge us to rethink the nutrient management paradigm. He will offer a look at data in cover cropping as a regenerative practice, provide evidence that biology is at work in recycling nutrients and improving soil health, and share implications for adaptive nutrient management systems. Dr. Kloot, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I wanted to talk about this whole idea of a paradigm, kind of thinking about the nutrient management paradigm and even some of those words. And sometimes I entitle this talk that I've done for a while and modified as Dirty Little Secrets from the Soil. And, part of it, I think, is just this whole idea of the posture we need to take as scientists towards the data, and really part of what I have realized over time is that we know, one of the things we realize is that the amount of information we know about the soil proportionally gets less and less over time when we really understand how living and dynamic the soil is. And I wanted to share with you a definition of paradigm because I sometimes talk about this and then I don't exchange or talk about what paradigm is. And a guy called Thomas Kuhn in the early 1960s coined this phrase, a paradigm shift in science. And if we want to explain paradigm today, we would say it's a set of concepts and assumptions that help us interpret the reality or the data. And so what we do is once we adopt a paradigm, it often becomes unconscious. In other words, we don't realize that we've adopted a particular way of looking at reality. And then what we do is when we look at the data, it helps us to formulate theories about the data. And then from that, we develop hypotheses, and that actually informs the way we ask our research questions. So we need to understand it's a way of thinking, and I'm going to give a couple of examples. For instance, a simple example would be at one stage we thought the sun and the moon and the planets revolved around the earth. And the scientific community was, that's how things happened. And then there were some anomalies, or that's how people viewed reality. And anyone who viewed reality other than that was considered crazy. And then with better instruments, you think about people like Kepler, who was at the end of that process. We started finding some anomalies in the data, and we eventually got to the point where the old paradigm of of the planets in a circular orbit around the Earth, the planets and the sun and the stars in a circular orbit around the Earth, that changed to our realizing we revolve around the sun, and in fact our orbits are not circular, but they're elliptical. The other way of thinking of this is that it's not always just about the data and the information. When I was 25, I used to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. And I knew smoking was bad for me, and I had all the data and the information. But one evening I was sitting at a pub, and a doctor by the name of Wotan Twichers came up to me and he said, Buz, you know, you need to, he was an Afrikaans guy, and he said, you need to come to my office tomorrow and I'll take a blood sample and I will show you all of your blood corpuscles that have been damaged by smoking. And I never had to make that visit because what happened was something just changed in me, and from that day I stopped smoking. And so it's not just information, but it's being able to see. When you have a certain paradigm in your head, you're going to see things differently. So I'm going to give you a few data points here in terms of how people see paradigms and how people have these little metaphors that they make that come from the paradigms, and we'll talk about metaphors as well. So long story, but basically, I've been in this business mainly working with farmers, and possibly the one thing I've learned in the last 7 years is, or the last 6 years, that it's not a lack of minerals in the soil, it's a lack of biology. Here you've got a picture of my friend Jason Carter. On the one side of the slide, you can see this beautiful green cover crop. It didn't have any fertilizer on it, and it's wonderful. I took it this year in March, and you can see that X there. And on the other field is a neighbor who had a wheat crop and had, by that stage, applied 90 units of lime. If you look down on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, you can see the soil surface there is exposed to the atmosphere. You can see it's a little bit weedy. And on the other side, you can see the soil surface is absolutely 100% covered with vegetation. If you take a little look underneath the soil surface over here, you can see these are both, again, we took these samples about 50 foot from one another. They're both mapped as an Orangeburg loamy sand. And you don't have to be a soil scientist to say that something is different in terms of the structure and the color of soils. And so what we've noticed, we can't always measure exactly what's going on, but what I have come to the conclusion is it's not a lack of minerals in the soil, it's a lack of biology. I'm going to give you a little bit of data, but let's give you one of the definitions of soil that used to be held. I don't know if it's still held, but a lot of people view soil as a medium to grow plants. And when we view soil as a medium to grow plants, you know, I think one of the consequences could be this. This is a picture that was taken in the heart of the South African Corn Belt. I think you could probably go to places in this country. I have seen pictures in Texas, for instance, where similar haboots happen. But I think one of the consequences of not paying attention to soil biology is you get things like this. And being an environmental scientist, I'm really aware of that kind of thing. One of the other thoughts I wanted to share with you was that, you know, we often hear the idea that fertilizer recommendations, because they come from land-grant universities, are both accurate and precise. And there's been a lot of research that went into it, you know, maybe almost a half century ago. What was really interesting was Dr. Brad Jorn from Purdue, I don't think he's there anymore, very well-known agronomist, was looking at phosphorus indices and kind of talking about how the nutrient recommendations from land-grant universities were enshrined in law because of the, you know, the phosphorus, and they used that in the phosphorus index. And what he noticed were that things happened between different states. There was this idea of magic at the border. And so while the data were acquired through calibrated trials, looking at the responses of various soils to fertilizers, the interpretation of that was quite different. And he looked at the difference between Indiana and Illinois, and these are values of fertilizer that farmers would pay for a particular soil test value, and then over a 2-year rotation of 180 bushel corn and 60 bushel soybeans. And so in Indiana, you would pay $235,000 for 1,000 acres, but in Illinois, it would be almost double that. In my part of the world, you could look at Georgia, where you pay $240,000 per acre versus Alabama, $135,000 per acre. And so Dr. Jones said, well, are the soils that much different in Indiana or Illinois? Are they that much different in Georgia and Alabama? And so often we have, the farmers that I talk to often carry the sense that these fertilizer recommendations are exactly what they need. But of course, they also know if they go to another lab, maybe a commercial lab, they would be, possibly putting quite a little bit more fertilizer on. So we need to understand that fertilizer recommendations are interpretations of the data. And as Brad Jones says, these recommendations are often built on pride and tradition, and often basically differing philosophies of whether this is a build up and maintain philosophy, or is this a nutrient sufficiency philosophy. So I wanted to point that out to you as we go there. And I'm not trying to bash land-grant universities, but just say this is not something that is accurate and precise, and that we know exactly how much fertilizer we need to put in our soils. One of the things that Thomas Kuhn talks about in the data is that, as technology improves, we start to see anomalies in the data, and we go back to Kepler with his telescopes. Well, in the last 7 years, we've seen a lot of data and we've seen some anomalies, and we had 3 data sets. One was a CIG that we started. At that stage, over 5 years, we had 50 acres, 5 fields, and then 13 management units. On the right-hand side of the screen, we did a set of 40 plots. It was an experimental system. We watched that over 4 years and 6 acres, 6 crops where we double cropped wheat with soybeans every second year. And the third was a guy called Sonny Price, where we looked at a sample of 2,500 acres. And one of the things that we noticed was that when we cover cropped, we actually noticed that our soil pHs stayed steady. That was the first chart that you see comes from our experiment that we did, or our Conservation Innovation Grant funded by USDA. The second one you can see followed kind of the similar things, and you can actually see that sometimes the pHs went up and down, and that was often what we found was often as a function of the timing of the samples. So that it went up and down, but the similarity of all these data sets is in the top 2, we never applied a pound of lime. In the bottom, we applied about a tenth of the lime that was recommended overall. And so what we noticed was our soil test pHs, once we started putting cover crops in the system, tended to level out. So that was kind of a surprise to us. The second thing was our soil test phosphoruses. In the top left hand, you can see our soil test phosphoruses. We stopped applying fertilizer phosphorus, and that was kind of, in this little small study, I asked my farmers to quit doing that. And instead of our soil test phosphorus dropping precipitously, we actually noticed that, phosphorus has tended to be steady in this one data set. And you can see they started to come down in the second data set. But every time we went out, and in the third data set, we actually saw a slight increase in soil test P. And every time we went out and took plant tissue samples, we noticed that we almost never had any deficiencies in phosphorus. In 2015, 2016, we took 279 plant tissue samples of corn, cotton, and wheat, and soybean. And we found that only 2 out of those 279 samples was deficient in P. And that was in early corn. We went back the following week and we found our soil test P was fine. So something else was at work in this situation. Even though our soil test Ps in one situation were dropping, we were not finding phosphorus deficiencies. Another thing that we were told initially was that we couldn't build soil organic matter. This was in the coastal plain soil of South Carolina. And the idea was that our climate was too warm and our soils were too sandy. And you can see in the conservation, the CIG that we had a 30% increase in soil organic matter over about a 5-year period. And we're seeing similar trends in the other data sets as well. So we realized that something else is going on. Soil is a living, dynamic ecosystem. Here's another picture of statistical analysis. I just got the November 2019 data in. So from November 2019 to November 2019, our soil test average has increased from about 1.15 to about almost 1.8% on average in these farms, which is quite phenomenal. So one of the things we have to understand here is that these soils were all cover cropped, and we had very, very little fallow, and we also had a fair amount of diversity in both in terms of crop rotations and then the cover crops. So one of the things that happened in about 2014 was that we were criticized, and rightly so, because we were not doing randomized replicated studies, and a lot of our data at that stage was purely observational. So farmer Carl Coleman and I teamed up, and we raised funds through experiment.com, because no one in their right minds would give a environmental health science professor from the University of South Carolina money to do fertilizer tests. And we did. We set out 40 plots on farm of Carl's land, and they were 60 foot by 100 foot. We wanted to be able to treat them with his farm machinery, which is what we did. And roughly, we had 4 treatments. One was full nitrogen and potassium. One was about 33% of the required nitrogen. One was about half, and then one was the full nitrogen. And the treatments 2, 3, and 4, we decided not to apply potassium. These were all soils in what was rated as a medium soil test regime in our soil test laboratories. This is in Orangeburg, loamy sand, so it tends to be a little bit lower on things like potassium and organic matter. What I want to do is kind of focus in on the potassium. By the way, the phosphorus soil test levels were all in the high to excessive for pretty much all of our experiments. So we never applied phosphorus in this situation. But anyway, so one of the paradigms that we have is, if you want to be successful, you need to apply phosphorus and potassium. And I just picked these 2 pictures off the web. And the one was, showing these horror stories of, look what happens if you don't apply phosphorus and potassium. And then they took the same picture and turned it sideways and said, well, here we are, this is a potassium deficiency. So I think sometimes we have kind of horror stories about what happens if we don't apply fertilizer. And I think those, and I've seen some pictures of cotton that had received no potassium in an experimental field, and it certainly looked like a horror story there. And I think if you go back to that field history, you'll see it has been tilled and probably never cover cropped either. So certainly these horror stories can come out if the land is being treated as a medium to grow plants and not as a living naturalistic ecosystem. Going back to this particular set of plots that Carl and I had, it was no-tilled for at least 20 years, and then about 2013, he started to plant cover crops. So cover crops were already integrated for several years, and this was a soil that was on the mend. And one of the things we've been told, especially again in the coastal plain, doesn't matter which, whether it's commercial folk or land grant folk, is if you don't apply that potassium, you're going to crash. And so for 4 years and 6 crops, again, it was, we started with wheat and double cropped soybeans in 2015, corn in 2016, wheat and double cropped soybeans in 2017, and corn in 2018. And where we had the prescribed fertilizer potassium, we noticed that our yields were not really significantly different from where we had no potassium applied at all over those 6 years. And these were on the same plots, so it was a cumulative effect. 2018, we had a terrifically dry year, and you'll notice that where we applied potassium, our yield was a little bit below, almost 10 bushels below. And so we sometimes wonder, and we couldn't prove this from the data, but if there was some kind of suppressive effect because we used potassium chloride or muriate of potash, 0060, to do this. And we just noticed that we weren't getting the yields that were, people in the industry and academia were telling us we had to do to get those yields. Now, again, I want to emphasize, before that, you can see we applied about 420 pounds of material, or K2O, which is about 300 pounds of elemental potassium. On the one set of plots, it was 10 plots, and on the other set of 10 plots, we applied 0 in all of that time. So we have to emphasize again, don't do this at home if you haven't been cover cropping and you haven't been no-tilling. It might work, but I don't think so. I think you've got to have a healthy soil. What we did was after corn in September, we planted a warm season cover. That got pretty big in a hurry. We terminated that corn, planted the wheat in November. After the soybeans were harvested, we planted a cool season cover and then planted the corn after that and repeated. So we never had any fallow periods in the system, and what we believe was happening is, we had biology going all the time that was accessing these nutrients. So the data are there. One can, I think we can hypothesize about why we had what we had. But the data are there to show that, in fact, there was no significant difference, and there was possibly a slight advantage where we didn't apply any potassium at all. One of the other things that, again, this is a narrative that farmers get all the time, is you've got to make sure that you at least add crop removal rates for fertilizer. And so this is an average of our 10 plots where we applied fertilizer. We applied the recommended fertilizer in front of wheat and corn each year. soybeans is double crop, so we applied the soybean fertilizer in front of the wheat as well. And so these are our soil test potassium values, and again, an average of 10. And you can see, if you look at it, if we do the math, we removed 225 pounds of potassium, but applied 350 pounds of potassium. So we were kind of plus 125. And you notice we still didn't see all of that report to the soil test. So you could say, well, that's full justification of why we would need to apply potassium. What is really interesting, so the blue bar is going to be your full potassium soil test. They started, of course, in December 2014, having been treated the same. So they, prior to that, they were treated the same. And you can see we actually started out with our zero potassium. The averages actually ended up to be a little bit lower, but, statistically pretty similar. And so what you can see is those trends over time. So the blue bars, we applied all the potassium necessary. In the yellow bars, we didn't. And if you notice, when we started out, the blue bars in December 2014 were a little bit higher. And in November 2018, the blue bars were a little bit lower. And that's kind of made us scratch our head, because obviously, that somehow we're not seeing the potassium addition in the soil test values. And kind of, again, that's what the narrative of, what farmers are getting. And so let's see, if we do the math, where we had full potassium fertilization, we removed 220 pounds, and then we added the 350 pounds of elemental potassium. Where we added zero potassium, we actually removed 228 pounds of potassium. So that was calculated on the yields that we had. Now, if you want to do the math here, we removed 228 pounds of potassium. We started at 101. We should have been somewhere in negative territory by November 2016, and we weren't there. And so that's, to many people, a head scratcher. Where's that potassium coming from? And if your paradigm is that potassium only comes from fertilizer, that's really going to leave you scratching your head, and you're probably going to say my math is wrong or I'm lying, which is fine. But these are the data that we had. One of the other things that we saw over here, instead of building the soils, we actually saw that the soils where we did not apply the potassium, the amount of potassium was more at the end than in comparison to where we did apply the potassium. And I went back to the literature, and there's a guy in China that actually produced something, and this was from Nature and Property of Soils in their potassium chapter, Dr. Ray Wild's book. And they were actually showing that with the application of artificial potash, we were actually seeing a suppression of the potassium fixation. Now, again, we would have to go out and do more experiments to figure this stuff out. But these are the data that came out of this 4-year experiment. When we started out, I never dreamed that we'd get these results. I thought that we could modify what happened, modify the amount of potassium we needed to apply. I never dreamed that by applying no potassium, we'd actually get better yields in a sandy, medium potassium soil test soil. So that kind of was something that changed the way I looked at soil. What we've done, in addition to just looking at soil tests to potassium, was the farmers that I've worked with said, well, how's that going to play out in our plant tissue samples? And I'm going to restrict most of my conversation just to the potassium. And what we noticed, this is cotton here, and what we noticed was cotton tissue, and this is leaf tissue samples, we found that the thing that influenced leaf tissue samples most was rain. If we had a dry period, our leaf tissue, our plant tissue sample potassium actually went down. When we did not have rain, when we did have rain, it actually went up. And this is a friend of mine in Georgia that took some samples. He applied a lot lower amount of potassium to his soils, and this was his first year. He'd been cover cropping for 3 years. He also applied a chicken litter, and we thought, I looked at that and I said, I think you're ready to wean yourself a little bit and apply much lower levels of potassium. Well, he came back with plant tissue potassium of just over the threshold. And he was a little bit nervous on the one, so there are 2 samples, the beach and the 50-acre field that he had. He was a little bit nervous and he was worried about it. And I said, well, what were the conditions? Well, it was May or early June, very, very hot and dry. Well, it turned out he had a rain storm just after he took those samples. And I said, go ahead and take those samples again. He took them again, and he sent them back to the lab. This time, you can see that the plant tissue potassium was up, was well above the threshold limit. And so, he was advised by a lot of people that clearly he'd made a mistake and he needed to put a lot of potassium on to rescue his crop. And when they saw these data, it was difficult for them to believe that. But then when you go back to farmers and you hear them, they'll say, well, somebody took my tissue samples and then they came back, recommended a particular application of X, Y, or Z, and they came back 2 weeks later. I didn't apply anything and I didn't tell them, and they said, oh, see what happened, look at your tissue samples, they're up. And so I think a lot of farmers recognize this. So and part of this is soils are dynamic and they're going to respond to weather conditions as well. One of the other things that I hear often is that cover crops suck the nutrients out of the soil, and I see I made a nice typo there. So cover crops suck the nutrients out of soils, and this is Jason Carter again. We had a conservation innovation grant where he had 5 plots on his land where he terminated a 20 by 20 foot strip, and so this is the average of 5 plots that we had. Our nitrogen we got from the Haney test, where we looked at organic nitrogen, nitrate nitrogen, and ammonium nitrogen, and you can see where we had cover, we had a 16 pound per acre difference in the nitrogen there. So clearly there was much lower nitrogen, and we found most of it was nitrate in the cover where we had a cover crop. Your phosphorus, you can see a 35 pound difference, and your potassium, you can see a 37 pound difference. Now this is Malik 1 that's measured by our local soil test lab or at our land grant university. So, but what we did just before termination, we went out and we also took a cover crop sample. And if you have a look, so what we did was we took the cover crop sample, we weighed it, we dried it, and then we sent it off to the lab and looked at the percentage of nutrients in that cover crop. And you'll see that while the soil test difference was 16 pounds per acre, we had 192 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the cover crop. Now you could argue, well, how much of that is plant available? Let's say 10% was plant available. You'd still have 19 pounds per acre of nitrogen in that cover crop. You can see that the phosphorus barely balanced out the phosphorus in the cover crop. But if you have a look at those phosphorus values, they are pretty high. And, we didn't have any concerns about phosphorus. Potassium is a big thing in our state, in our coastal plains. And so we'd always be worried if our potassium were low, but you can see while the soil test difference is 37 pounds per acre, where we had cover, we had 269 pounds per acre in the cover crop. So if you're doing the math, that was about an 8,000 or 9,000 pound per acre cover crop dry biomass, and we had about 3% potassium and about 2.5% nitrogen, if I remember correctly, in the cover crop. So you can see cover crops do take those nutrients out of the soils, but once you terminate them, those nutrients get back in the soils in a hurry. Yes, timing is important, but what we found, what Jason's found over time, he doesn't apply any commercial potash or phosphorus, that is just not an issue for him anymore. The other narrative is that cover crops suck the life out of soils, and in those same plots that we had, we looked at PLFA, or phospholipid fatty acid. This is just a way of looking at the soil microbial activity and the diversity. And what you can find is our PLFA readings were typically, for the PLFA and the total bacteria, were about 1.5 times higher where we had a cover crop versus where we had no cover crop. You can see rhizobia increased by almost double. But what's real interesting is our total fungal biomass. So that's both the saprophytic fungi and the mycorrhizal fungi actually increased by about a factor of 2. So our fungal to bacterial ratio also increased there. Again, what is the saying? Can we make any recommendations from this? No, but it's an indicator that soil biology is at work when we're feeding the soil. And we'll talk about that in a little while, because sometimes we say feed the soil, and feeding the soil has different, when we use those words, it has different meanings to different people depending what your paradigm is. I often watch people or hear people talk about diversity if they subscribe to, say, a physical chemical paradigm, and talk about diversity and use air quotes for that. And so, what we often hear is cover crop diversity or microbial diversity, or microbes in general have, yeah, they're there, but it makes no difference in the real world. In the real world, you've got to apply the chemicals to make the crops grow. So one of the things we did on that farm, on Jason's farm, where we had those plots, we cut some cover crops and then we separated them out into species. And we looked at the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium of 5 rye samples, 2 vetch samples, a radish samples, and then 4 clover samples. And what you can see is for your nitrogen, the vetch and clover, not surprisingly, has the highest amount of nitrogen because they're legumes. And so you can see how much more there is compared to our rye over there. We took these, you can see these are the samples. We took that rye was still, I think it was close to soft dough stage. It had not matured yet, but you can see how much less nitrogen there was in that rye. If you look at the cover crop potassium, the vetch and the radish, phosphorus, the vetch and the radish really shone. And I was really shocked at how much potash that radish pulled up compared to everything else. You can see that was a nice thing, because we know that when those radishes get killed, they turn to jello and they just leave a hole in the ground and a little wisp of residue, and the rest seems to go back into the soil. Vetch and radish again pulled up a lot more calcium, especially than the rye. And then if we go to the micronutrients, this is, again, radish is a brassica. So you can see it was able to pull in a lot more of the sulfur. What was really interesting to me was that clover seemed to be a much better accumulator of boron, which was interesting. I know a lot of people believe that you've got to apply boron each year. The vetch, again, looked like it was better at pulling in the zinc. and then the radish, the manganese. So what I'm trying to say is when we have these diverse cover crops, each cover crop brings something different to the mix, and when it decomposes, and even when it's possibly even when it's living, it's bringing something else to the party. We're looking at soil chemistry, or at least plant chemistry here. The biology is that much more complex, that what we can see just from looking at plant chemistry, something is going on in these systems or in these soils. Which brings me to, it's related to the paradigms that we have. And I want to talk about systems thinking in terms of the guy, I forgot, no, his last name eludes me, so I'm not going to talk about, mention his name. But when we talk about systems, you know, in reductionist thinking is really important in science, where we vary a single thing and then keep everything else constant. You know, this is part of how we learn about stuff. And, you know, it's essential for us to move science forward. But in reductionist thinking, we have the parts are going to be primary, the whole is going to be secondary, and so that works well in experiments when we're looking at, say, as you guys saw, looking just at the effect of potassium fertilizer on a cover cropped field. But the parts are primary and the whole is secondary. In systems thinking, the whole is primary and the parts are secondary. And that's where you have a system, say, in our farming systems, we've got, if we're applying the 5 principles of soil health, minimum disturbance, so that's physical, chemical, and biological. Part of it is not tilling as much, not applying as much chemical, and starting to mimic nature, you know, in terms of the kind of cover crops we want. Keeping a live root in the soil year-round is the second principle. Third principle is keeping the soil covered with either a canopy or a residue. Fourth principle is diversity, diversity, diversity. And then, of course, the fifth principle is bringing in livestock into that system. And sorry, the guy's name is Dr. Randy Anderson. I met him in Brookings ARS in South Dakota, and he said, if you practice one thing, like say a no-till, over time you'll find certain benefits. But if you start adding things like cover crops and then longer rotations and then bringing in animals, every time you add something else to that system, it's not 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It's going to be 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. So there's a system synergy as we find a lot of interactive effects going on. And this is what we're seeing on working farms, certainly that I work for. And I think a lot of farmers, if you go onto soil health forums, is people are seeing this. You may not see it on a research station, but you're going to see this stuff out on farms. So I wanted to kind of maybe re-examine a reductions versus systems explanation, reductionist versus systems explanation, and say, well, if we're just looking at a part, that is kind of part of the paradigm of viewing soil as the 6-inch layer of dirt that is a living, that is a medium to grow plants, rather than saying soils are much deeper, they're living dynamic ecosystems. And so if we say, gosh, you know, why did we get the data where we had no response to potassium? Well, one of the reasons could be that soil roots go deeper than 6 inches. And we discovered this in our sandy coastal plain soils a few years ago, was that there is 3 times more soil test potassium in the 6-inch to 24-inch layer than there was in the top 6-inch layer. When we discovered that, we said, well, boy, all we need to do is grow our roots down below 6 inches and we can tap into that. So that's one of the explanations. If you go to the literature, you'll see that, you know, there's never been any question that if you look at the amount of potassium in the minerals, there's always been plenty of potassium, but when you're growing crops, it's more the timing that takes place. So if you've got peak requirement from a crop, you know, a lot of people say you're going to run out of potassium. And so basically the potassium is made available either through a fertilizer or possibly through biology. And in this situation, we think that the biology that we had actually made that potassium available, the biology that we developed through the cover crops over time. So that's maybe another explanation why we didn't see a yield difference. So rather than just look at that 6-inch soil slice, we've got to have a look at the whole system, and I'm sure there are other explanations that I'm not even talking about. The other thing is when we're in a degraded or a brittle system or a regenerative or resilient system, you'll see that when you're in a regenerative or resilient system, like I think these soils were, we saw less response to these commercial fertilizers than if we had gone to a research station that had been tilled and left bare, and where the soil health principles had been ignored. Let's have another look at this one over here. Build your soils with fertilizer. Clearly, again, these are the data that we had, but you know, if we say possibly because we had the biology in the soil, we were able to access more potassium in that soil. If we removed 228 pounds of potassium where we applied 0 pounds of K, potassium must have been made available in some other way. Now, our plots were 60 foot by 60 foot, and Carl was pretty careful of making sure, 60 by 100 foot, he was pretty careful in making sure that there was no overflow. We had 5-foot gaps between those crops, so I don't think accidental spreading of potassium from one plot to the other was a factor in here. So again, we think that biology, excited biology, was making this potassium available more to those soils than in a soil that might not have been biologically active. The third one over here, we kind of talked about it already. Rather than the knee-jerk of reaction of running out and putting another 60 units of K2O on your soil when you get a low soil plant tissue potassium, you know, why not look at what the weather conditions were? And in this case, the broader thing in terms of the system, our weather was different. We had more soil moisture when we went out and took those plant tissue potassium samples the second time. So one has to look at these things not in a completely reductionist way, but look at the system as a whole. And I think as we go down the soil health route, the system approach is what we have to look at over here. You can see kind of the same principles at work here. It's not like we're making more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Something else is happening to make those nutrients available to those plants, and yet we're not seeing all of those plants, all of those soils being depleted of soil NP and K, and we can say the same for the micronutrients. So Joseph Campbell is kind of one of my heroes, and one of the things he said, if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor. And what do I mean by a metaphor? Well, let's talk about how metaphors are in our not subconscious, they're unconscious as well. So I can you know, I came up to Greensboro today, and I might tell David, my host here, that I'm feeling up. So when David looks at me and he says, and he hears me say, I'm feeling up, he's not going to look up in the sky. He unconsciously knows that I'm in a good mood. Or I come to him and say, I'm looking down, I'm feeling down, he's not going to look at my shoes. Or if I say I feel blue, he's not going to look for a color in my face. These are unconscious metaphors that we hold. If you say the classroom is a zoo, I'm not going to find a lot of zebras and lions and tigers in the classroom. Everybody knows what I mean by that metaphor. And so one of the things that I hope to present, that comes across in this is that if we're aware of the metaphors we use, and if we're aware of our paradigms, it helps us to see the data differently. Just as when I knew that cigarette smoking was really bad, but the threat of even looking at my own blood kind of changed my mind for me. Why that happened, I don't know. And it happens with farmers across the country. I received a fantastic insight from someone who was really, really skeptical about soil health. And this person said, y'all are advocating a perpetual motion machine to us. And I just don't believe it. And I totally get that. Coincidentally, that week or a few weeks earlier, I'd seen something that said basically with 2 minutes of the sun's energy falling on the earth, if we captured all of that, we could power the Earth's total energy budget for a year, theoretically. And that was kind of mind-blowing to me. And then it was like, and you know, the manufacturers of these solar panels, you know, oh, this is a fantastic reason why we should buy it. But it occurred to me that farmers have been doing this for millennia. Farmers know that we have to capture sunlight, of course, capture water, and we do that through green plants and photosynthesis. And I took this picture specifically with the, you know, with the plants, and it was a warm season cover crop planted behind corn. There's an expression, and I can't remember who to attribute to this, but plants are the mouth of the soil. When we think about nutrients, we think nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and the micronutrients. We never think about carbon. So what do plants do? They take carbon dioxide and water and the sun's energy, turn it into sugars, and then turn that oxygen out. So when we talk about feeding the soil, if you have a chemical mindset, you're probably thinking we need to feed the soil with fertilizer. When farmers who talk about this, or when people whose paradigms have shifted, and when they talk about feeding the soil, they'll feed the soil with plants. There's a company called Drop Time. The guy, the owner, Brad, sent me a T-shirt, and on the back, the T-shirt said, "Plants fix dirt." And most people who see that will not get it, but plants fix dirt through fixing carbon. So I got this from Dr. Chris Nichols. Photosynthesis, most efficient conversion of solar to chemical energy. Way more efficient than our solar panels. And this happens in the bonds between carbon atoms and then between carbon atoms and other atoms. And this is really, really important to understand, because sunlight is going to drive so much of the biology that is going to access the nutrients. Dr. Elaine Ingham makes a statement that a lot of people don't agree with, but I do agree with. She says, if you run out of dirt, that's when you're going to run out of nutrients, because basically, if you have the right biology there, the biology will will access those. And I'm probably wrong, but that's what I subscribe to. Dr. Chris Nichols, I remember in one of her lectures, said, carbon is the energy currency of the soil. And so we see these microbes, bacteria, fungi, protozoans, nematodes, and then your earthworms and your microarthropods. And our eyes tend to naturally gravitate towards those things, and we don't notice that sun up there. If we don't have that sun and we don't have that plant, you can say goodbye to those microbes, because those microbes, most of them are living in some kind of symbiotic relationship with the plant, usually in that rhizosphere. So how does carbon get into the soil? When I started out on my soil health journey, I thought, well, the way carbon gets in the soil is the plant dies and then it decomposes, and that's how it gets in the soil. Well, no, that's not the case. We've got a whole lot of things that happen. As your roots grow, those little epidermis cells are going to get rubbed off and become part of the soil, get consumed by microbes. Plants going to secrete glues, root exudates. Usually those exudates are sugar. All you need to do is go down into a really nice growing corn root and break that off and taste it. It is very, very sweet and sometimes tastes like peanuts. Your volatile organic carbon, carbon that goes directly to mycorrhizal fungi. So these mycorrhizal fungi are growing, start out, actually germinate inside the plant root, and they actually have a direct pipeline to carbon, and then they extend these networks out. And then, of course, the carbon from dead plant cells, which are, as our residues decompose. But these are different routes that carbon gets into the soil and supplies that energy. You take away the plants, you take away the sunlight, and your soil biology starts to die. So I wanted to kind of just talk about microbes because we're going to classify them into 4 things. For an old chemical engineer like me, this is about as much classification as I want, but we have bacteria, fungi, protozoans, and nematodes. And bacteria tend to be, we have photosynthesizers, not a lot of them, decomposers, neutralists, in other words, they live with plants and with fungi, and then we also have pathogenic bacteria. And in our system, often, which is an antibiotic system, we often want to focus on the bacterial and fungal pathogens, and of course the root-feeding nematodes. And so when we do that, we forget that the vast majority, especially in a balanced or healthy system, of our microbes are actually beneficial. In our fungi, we have decomposers like saprophytic fungi that are going to break down plant residues. We've got neutralists, which are those mycorrhizal fungi. And if you look at the top right-hand corner, that long strand there you can see is a beneficial fungus, which is just that long strand just below the little Mickey Mouse head there. That little Mickey Mouse head there, by the way, is those brown things are fungal spores. And then the teeny tiny dots, the tiniest dots that you can see, some of them are transparent, would be bacteria. This is taken from my $700 high school microscope in my lab. And you can see that those things are quite visible and accessible to people with even the most rudimentary of equipment. Protozoans tend to be grazers. So if you have a look over here, this is a testate amoeba, and this amoeba lives inside this test or this shell, and he goes ahead and gobbles up the bacteria. So those little colorless blobs you can see, those are bacteria, and so he's going to gobble bunches of them, up to 10,000 bacteria a day. And you can also see, if you look very closely, I'm going to move my mouse, you can also see here's a testate amoeba. Okay, we got 5 minutes. So, and then nematodes tend to be grazers. They'll graze on bacteria and fungi, and they tend to, we've got the root feeders, which we tend to focus on, and then also predators. And here is a bacterial feeding nematode. But I wanted you to look at the metaphors over here. If we change our metaphor from these microbes being pests, what if bacteria and fungi were little bags of fertilizer? What if bacteria were teenagers or sheep that love to feed on short-chain fatty acids? What about if the fungi were goats and miners? They mine the soil. The goats would actually feed on the wood or the residue. They're the internet in terms of mycorrhizal fungi. Protozoans, the grazers. Well, if you've got fertilizer bags, fungi and bacteria, but you don't have the fertilizer bag openers and spreaders, the protozoans and nematodes, those fertilizer bags will never open. So the protozoans and nematodes are part of that system that are going to recycle your nutrients. Now, my time's very close. If we look at the soil food web, we can put it together with two questions, and I'm going to leave them for you. Number one, how are the nutrients being recycled in a healthy system over here? And number two, where does the energy come from? And I hope I've explained that very carefully. These are mycorrhizal fungi that I took, again, at different magnifications, and they're embedded in the plant. We've really looked at some of the data in cover-cropped regenerating soils. So if you've got tilled, not cover-cropped soils, don't try this at home. We also looked at evidence that biology is at work. It's important to know it's powered by the sun in recycling nutrients and improving soil health. And the third thing is there are implications for adaptive nutrient management strategies. And some people say, well, you need to do this and you need to take that soil test. But the best way to adapt your nutrient strategy is to start looking at things like check strips, and strips with half amounts of fertilizer and full amounts of fertilizer so that you yourself can see what's going on. There's no need that I see that the farmer cannot become her or his own scientist. And I like to finish off with this because a lot of what I say is controversial and people like to critique me, and I'm sure there's plenty of material to critique me, but I like to always end off with, and that's all I said was that we don't need that much fertilizer. So thank you so much for your time and patience, and appreciate your listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Kloot, for your contribution to the Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Kloot, please contact us at info@soilhealthinstitute.org so that we can get you in touch to answer those questions. And in our next episode, Dr. Jason Schmidt will be talking with us about ecological pest management. So subscribe to our channel so that you're among the first to be notified about any new episodes in this webinar series. Thank you very much.